It began not in public view, but inside the sealed corridors of Whitehall where Privy Council papers are meant to remain untouchable. A single whispered correction on a routine charter draft changed the temperature of the entire institution. By the time Prince Edward was informed, the document had already been quietly altered, and one name, Sophie's, was no longer where it was supposed to be. That absence would soon echo far beyond protocol into constitutional alarm. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What should have been a routine circulation of a Privy Council charter in early 2026 began like countless others before it structured. Predictable, almost ceremonial in its administrative calm, officials moved through familiar steps, reviewing clauses that had passed through layers of validation. Each signature meant to reinforce continuity rather than question it. Yet within this carefully maintained order, subtle irregularities began to surface. A revised draft appeared with last-minute administrative adjustments, described internally as minor refinements, though the timing alone made several senior clerks uneasy. Nothing in the formal record flagged urgency, but the atmosphere around the document shifted in a way that seasoned staff could not ignore. Prince Edward was briefed ahead of the formal Privy Council session, a courtesy extended only when continuity required absolute clarity. The briefing itself was brief, almost too controlled, as if every word had been weighed for consequence. Yet what reached him was enough to disrupt his composure. Sophie's designation, previously embedded within ceremonial recognition clauses, was missing in the latest version of the charter. Not crossed out, not annotated, simply absent, as though it had never been there at all. That detail alone transformed what should have been procedural reading into something far more sensitive, something that carried implications beyond paperwork. Within the administrative corridors, an unusual silence followed the discovery. Clerks who normally cross-referenced revisions instinctively avoided commentary, exchanging only brief, cautious glances before returning to their screens. There was no official instruction to remain quiet, yet the restraint felt enforced by something unspoken and understanding that this was not a matter to be expanded upon lightly. Even senior aides, known for their precision in handling protocol, began referring to the change in vague terms such as adjustments in recognition formatting, avoiding any direct mention of what had actually been removed. As Edward prepared for the session, the tension surrounding him grew denser, though nothing outwardly appeared out of order. He was advised, with careful phrasing, to proceed as scheduled and allow the matter to be clarified through normal procedural channels. But that guidance only deepened the contradiction. If everything was normal, why did it require clarification at all? Courtiers began to quietly question the origin of the revision, tracing it backward through layers of approvals that seemed complete on paper, yet strangely opaque in practice. No single point of responsibility could be clearly identified, and that absence of accountability began to unsettle even the most disciplined observers. By the time the council chamber prepared to convene, the unease had spread beyond isolated concern and settled into collective hesitation. Documents that once symbolized institutional certainty now carried the weight of uncertainty, as though each page might conceal another silent alteration. The absence of Sophie's name was no longer treated as a simple discrepancy, but as a signal one that suggested a deeper shift in how recognition, authority, and approval were being quietly recalibrated within the system itself. But the missing name was only the surface disturbance. What lay beneath the charter's revision pointed toward a deeper institutional fracture no one had yet dared to name. The Privy Council convened under its usual ritual precision: polished oak tables, sealed folders, and centuries of uninterrupted protocol. Yet beneath the ceremony, something felt misaligned. Prince Edward, seated among senior counselors, reviewed the charter line by line. Insiders later described the moment as subtle but unmistakable. A pause too long, a silence too sharp, when he reached the section where Sophie's recognition should have been. The meeting continued in its formal rhythm, but the tone had already shifted in ways no one could officially acknowledge. Still, what was unfolding was not yet understood for what it truly was. The agenda itself carried no outward signs of controversy. On paper, it was a standard approval session for updated Royal Charter documentation routine amendments, procedural confirmations, and the steady reinforcement of institutional continuity. The room reflected that expectation. Councillors sat in ordered silence, documents aligned with disciplined precision, every gesture controlled and familiar. Yet even in this carefully maintained structure, tension began to seep in through the smallest inconsistencies. Pages turned more slowly than usual. Eyes lingered a fraction longer on specific clauses. The atmosphere was no longer fully ceremonial, it had become observant. Prince Edward, positioned as the senior reviewing member, for the Charter's sensitive amendments, moved through the document with measured focus. But when he reached the ceremonial clause that historically acknowledged Sophie's position, his attention halted. The expected reference was not there. Not altered in tone, not reworded, simply missing in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Without drawing attention, he quietly cross-checked earlier drafts circulated weeks before, his movements restrained but unmistakably purposeful. The discrepancy did not resolve itself with explanation, it only deepened the sense that something structural had shifted beneath the surface of procedure. Around him, junior clerks exchanged brief, uneasy glances, careful not to interrupt the formal flow of proceedings. Their silence was not commanded, yet it was absolute. Senior officials maintained composure, offering no immediate acknowledgement of irregularity. Instead, reinforcing the assurance that no deviation exists on record. The phrase, itself, repeated with practiced calm, began to feel less like clarification and more like containment. It did not answer the question, it redirected it. And in that subtle redirection, uncertainty grew heavier. Edward did not react theatrically. There was no interruption, no disruption of protocol. Instead, he placed the document down with deliberate control and requested clarification in a tone that preserved the dignity of the chamber while quietly altering its emotional temperature. The question was simple, almost administrative in form, but its weight carried far beyond its wording. A faint tightening followed across the room. Officials shifted in their seats, not visibly alarmed but undeniably unsettled by the precision of his inquiry. Because what had been framed as a procedural review was now being examined as something else entirely. As the response delayed, the silence inside the chamber grew more pronounced than any spoken explanation. What should have been a straightforward confirmation of documentation instead turned into a pause filled with unspoken calculation. Every second stretched the boundary between routine governance and something far more sensitive. The Charter, once a symbol of continuity, now felt like a document under quiet interrogation. Still, what appeared to be a clerical adjustment was about to reveal itself as something far more deliberate and far more personal. It was not an omission that could be explained away as error. The alteration was precise, deliberate, and formally validated through channels that required multiple signatories. Prince Edward reportedly froze mid-review as he compared documents, old and new versions telling two different institutional truths. Sophie's name had not been accidentally removed. It had been formally excised from recognition within the Charter's most sensitive clause. And in that single realization, what once appeared procedural began to resemble something far more calculated, more controlled. As Edward turned back to the archived version of the Charter, the contrast became impossible to dismiss. The discrepancy was not cosmetic or clerical, it was structural. Entire references had been reweighted, language subtly reclassified, and ceremonial acknowledgments redefined in a way that only made sense if the change had been planned through official channels rather than improvised in haste. This was not the language of correction. It was the language of authorization. Authorization implied intent. The deeper Edward looked, the more unsettling the documentation became. Multiple approval layers were visible, each one suggesting that the revision had passed through normal governance filters. Nothing appeared bypassed. Nothing appeared forced. And yet, the result itself defied expectation. Courtiers nearby, observing his silence, began to feel the shift in atmosphere before anything was spoken aloud. There was a difference between confusion and recognition. Edward was no longer confused. He was recognizing a pattern. Attempts to trace the origin of the amendment quickly dissolved into procedural ambiguity. One office redirected to another. One approval trail ended in a sealed reference. Another looped back into higher coordination review, a phrase used sparingly, and only when accountability was deliberately softened into abstraction. That phrase, repeated quietly among staff, carried an unspoken weight. It suggested authority without naming it, direction without attribution. And in that ambiguity, suspicion began to take root. What made the situation even more difficult to dismiss was the internal reclassification surrounding Sophie's role within ceremonial documentation. It was not erased in a dramatic fashion, but softened, reshaped, absorbed into broader language that reduced its visibility without triggering formal alarm. To outside eyes, nothing appeared broken. But to those who understood the structure of these charters, absence delivered its own kind of message. It signaled repositioning. It signaled decision. Edward's demeanor changed in ways that did not require announcement. The procedural calm he had maintained earlier gave way to something heavier, more personal, yet still contained within discipline. He no longer moved through the document as an administrator verifying structure, but as someone confronting implication. Each page now carried dual meaning: what it said and what it no longer allowed to be said. The weight of that distinction settled across the chamber without a word being spoken. Around him, tension grew among senior council advisors, who now understood the review had crossed a threshold. What began as clarification had evolved into scrutiny, and scrutiny within this environment was never without consequence. Conversations became shorter, instructions became more cautious. Even silence became strategic. The chamber itself seemed to tighten, as though every participant was now aware that the document had stopped being neutral. And once Edward understood that the removal was intentional, the question was no longer what changed, but who had the authority to make it happen. Witnesses inside the chamber later described a shift in Prince Edward's composure that was almost imperceptible at first, a tightening of posture, a silence that replaced his usual measured calm. Then came the question, delivered without theatrics but with unmistakable weight. Who authorized the revision? In that moment, the Privy Council meeting ceased to feel ceremonial. It became confrontational. And what had once been a controlled environment of procedural certainty suddenly carried the pressure of institutional exposure. Edward did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The force of his inquiry came from its precision, not its volume. He requested formal clarification on the amendment authority, not as a challenge to decorum, but as a direct demand for accountability within a system that was built on traceable responsibility. For a brief moment, the chamber seemed to hesitate with him, as if even the architecture itself was acknowledging the weight of the question. The response, however, moved in a different direction. Officials attempted to redirect attention toward procedural compliance, speaking in carefully structured language that emphasized process over origin. References were made to standard review channels, phrases that carried institutional authority but avoided naming any individual or office directly responsible. It was a familiar strategy within the system to clarify the method, blur the author. But this time, it did not settle the tension. It only sharpened it. Edward, now fully anchored in the discrepancy, shifted the focus back to the documents themselves. He challenged the consistency between earlier legal drafts and the final charter presented before the council, drawing attention to the gap that could not be reconciled through generic explanation. His tone remained controlled, yet every word carried the weight of sustained scrutiny. The issue was no longer about formatting or revision. It was about legitimacy, how something so structurally significant could pass through layers of oversight without a clear point of ownership. As the exchange deepened, senior clerks began to retreat into silence, avoiding eye contact, avoiding even the subtle movements that might signal alignment. One official, previously confident in procedural assurance, now appeared hesitant to engage at all, as if any statement risked becoming binding under Edward's line of questioning. The chamber's rhythm collapsed into uneven pauses, where every attempted clarification seemed to create further instability rather than resolution. Sophie's removal, once treated as a narrow discrepancy in ceremonial recognition, now stood at the center of the dispute. It was no longer a detail buried within clauses, it had become the focal point through which authority itself was being tested. If such a change could be validated without clear attribution, then the entire structure of approval long assumed to be unbreakable was now open to question. That realization shifted the atmosphere from discomfort to defensive tension, as officials began to realize the conversation was no longer contained within procedural boundaries. Edward's questioning expanded accordingly. He began to probe not only the change itself but the legitimacy of the validation process that allowed it to pass. His inquiry moved beyond the document and into the system that produced it, exposing the fragile assumption that oversight automatically guaranteed integrity. The chamber, once unified by formality, now felt divided by interpretation: what was approved, what was assumed, and what could no longer be clearly traced. But instead of answers, what followed was silence, one that would soon break the fragile equilibrium of the entire chamber. What happened next was not officially recorded in full detail, but multiple sources confirm a singular moment of disruption. Prince Edward stood, closed the charter file, and left the Privy Council chamber. No raised voice. No public declaration. Just a measured exit that carried the weight of institutional protest. And behind him, a room that had not seen such a breach of protocol in years fell into stunned stillness. The silence that followed was not procedural, it was disorienting, as if the chamber itself had momentarily lost its expected order. Edward did not hesitate once he made the decision. The document, still open moments earlier as the subject of intense scrutiny, was closed with deliberate finality. No signature followed, no continuation of approval. In the language of the institution, it was not simply a pause, it was a refusal to proceed under current conditions. That distinction mattered, because within Privy Council tradition, absence of approval is rarely neutral. It is interpreted. And what it signaled in that moment was a breakdown in consensus at the very heart of procedure. As he stepped away from the table, the chamber's reaction lagged behind reality. Council members remained frozen, caught between the instinct to maintain formality and the shock of what they had just witnessed. Some reportedly glanced towards senior advisors, searching for direction that did not arrive. Others avoided movement altogether, as if any reaction might deepen the breach rather than contain it. Even the security detail, trained to respond to far more explicit disruptions, hesitated, uncertain whether protocol demanded intervention or restraint. The meeting itself did not immediately resume. There was no clear instruction to continue, no formal pause declared, and yet everything stopped. The absence of direction became its own kind of instruction. Pages remained open. Pens were set down. The structure of the session, so carefully constructed, now lacked momentum. And in that suspended state, one unresolved issue rose above everything else: the absence of Sophie's recognition within the charter, now no longer a technical inconsistency, but the central fault line through which the entire exchange was being interpreted. Palace aides outside the chamber moved quickly, not with panic, but with urgency shaped by experience. They understood that perception inside these walls often became consequence outside them. Quiet conversations began forming corridors of containment, efforts to frame the walkout not as rupture, but as procedural disagreement. Yet even among those tasked with stabilizing the situation, there was an awareness that something deeper had already shifted. This was no longer a matter of document revision, it had become a question of institutional cohesion. Inside the chamber, the absence of Edward was more impactful than his presence had been moments earlier. The silence he left behind carried a different weight, one that could not be easily absorbed back into procedure. It lingered. In the spacing between officials, in the hesitation before speech, in the refusal of the moment to return to normal rhythm. What had been contained tension was now exposed instability. But inside the palace, the walkout was not seen as an end, it was recognized as the beginning of something far more destabilizing. Within hours, the palace was no longer discussing procedure, it was managing perception. Prince Edward's departure from the Privy Council triggered an immediate chain reaction of internal briefings, urgent clarifications, and tightly controlled messaging. Officials insisted continuity remained intact, but behind closed doors, questions multiplied faster than answers could be contained. What had begun as a single walkout was now treated as an institutional risk event, something that demanded not explanation, but containment. And in that shift alone, the tone of the entire palace changed. An emergency internal review of the charter revision process was activated almost immediately, pulling together senior aides, legal advisors, and select constitutional officers who rarely shared the same table unless the matter was critical. The focus was not just the document itself, but the pathway it had taken: every approval, every sign-off, every assumed layer of verification that now needed to be re-examined under pressure. What had previously been treated as routine governance was suddenly being dissected like evidence, each stage questioned for what it revealed, what it concealed. At the same time, senior aides began working to stabilize the narrative around Edward's exit. Their language remained carefully neutral, emphasizing continuity, tradition, and institutional resilience. But within internal exchanges, the priority was clear: prevent escalation from becoming interpretation. The walkout could not be allowed to evolve into symbolism. It had to remain procedural in the public framing, even as internally it was understood as something far more disruptive. Every phrase was weighed not for accuracy alone, but for its ability to reduce tension. As the review deepened, uncomfortable questions began surfacing about the authorization trail behind the charter changes. Not just who approved it, but how many layers of validation had passed without challenge. The structure that was supposed to ensure absolute clarity was now revealing gaps of ambiguity, where responsibility appeared distributed just enough to avoid direct attribution. The diffusion of authority, once considered a strength of governance, was now becoming its most sensitive vulnerability. Communication teams were instructed to avoid any public escalation. The directive was not optional, it was strategic. No confirmation, no denial, no amplification of detail. The goal was simple: prevent fragmentation of perception outside the institution while internal clarity was still incomplete. Yet silence once again carried its own consequences. In the absence of explanation, speculation inevitably began to form its own narrative structure. Meanwhile, Sophie's status within internal documentation was quietly flagged as a sensitive adjustment, a phrase that carried more weight in its ambiguity than in its definition. It did not resolve the issue, it shielded it. Within legal and ceremonial offices, this classification immediately became a point of division. Legal advisors focused on procedural validity, insisting the chain of approval determined legitimacy. Ceremonial officials, however, questioned the implications of altering recognition without explicit transparency. The disagreement was not loud, but it was structural: two interpretations of the same system beginning to drift apart. As pressure increased, trust between council members began to erode in subtle but significant ways. Conversations shortened, assumptions replaced clarifications. What once moved through shared understanding now required verification at every step. Even long-standing working relationships began to reflect hesitation, as if each participant was now aware that alignment could no longer be taken for granted. The institution was not breaking openly, but it was no longer fully unified in how it understood itself. Through it all, the palace maintained its priority: containment over transparency. Every decision was filtered through that lens, every response shaped by the need to prevent further instability. Yet containment, by its nature, does not erase tension, it compresses it. And what was being held inside the system was beginning to build pressure in ways that could not remain internal indefinitely. Yet containment inside the palace could not prevent what was already beginning to leak beyond its walls. It did not take long for fragments of the Privy Council incident to surface beyond official channels. First came whispers from administrative staff, then selective interpretations in media circles. By the time senior correspondents began referencing the charter discrepancy, The story had already transformed into something larger than protocol. It had become a question of trust within the monarchy itself. And once that shift occurred, the narrative could no longer be contained within palace walls. It had already begun to live its own life outside them. What emerged first were not full revelations, but fragments, carefully incomplete accounts shared through council-adjacent staff, who had witnessed only portions of the internal tension. These early leaks were vague enough to avoid direct confirmation, yet specific enough to reshape perception. Terms like unexpected charter revision and procedural deviation within Privy Council documentation began appearing in commentary circles, each phrase carrying enough ambiguity to avoid denial, but enough precision to spark attention. In that space between clarity and secrecy, speculation began to grow. As journalists and media insiders pieced together these fragments, competing narratives quickly formed. Some framed Prince Edward's walkout as a contained procedural disagreement, a momentary clash over administrative consistency that would eventually be resolved within institutional norms. Others, however, interpreted the same event as something deeper, a visible rupture in how authority and validation were being handled behind closed doors. The same facts, or partial facts, were now producing entirely different truths depending on interpretation. Divergence itself became part of the story. At the center of this unfolding narrative remained the question of Sophie's removal from the charter. What had begun as a subtle internal discrepancy was now becoming the focal point of public speculation. Without official clarification, every detail surrounding it gained disproportionate weight. Analysts and commentators began asking whether the change reflected a routine adjustment or something more intentional within the hierarchy of approval. The absence of explanation created space for assumption, and assumption quickly hardened into narrative momentum. Throughout this escalation, the palace maintained its silence, declining to confirm or deny specific details related to the revision or the walkout. That silence, however, did not stabilize the situation, it intensified it. In the absence of institutional voice, external interpretation became dominant. Every refusal to comment was read not as neutrality, but as strategic restraint. And that perception only deepened curiosity about what was being withheld. As coverage expanded, analysts began questioning the internal cohesion of the Privy Council itself. What had once been viewed as one of the most stable mechanisms of royal governance was now being examined for its internal transparency, its approval structures, and its capacity to manage sensitive amendments without visible fracture. The conversation shifted from one incident to systemic confidence. If one revision could pass through layers of validation without clear attribution, what else might be moving through the system unseen? Public attention, once peripheral, now began to intensify around broader questions of governance stability. The monarchy was no longer being discussed only in terms of tradition or ceremony, but in terms of procedural integrity. Every new report, every analysis, every cautious leak added another layer to an evolving perception that something within the structure had been tested in ways not fully acknowledged. And as interpretation wars unfolded outside, the institution inside was already facing the consequences of a fracture it could no longer fully control. In the days that followed, there was no dramatic reversal, no public confrontation, only a quiet recalibration within the machinery of the monarchy. Prince Edward resumed duties, but under noticeably different conditions, as if every step forward now carried an invisible weight of scrutiny. The Privy Council continued its work, yet the absence of resolution lingered like an unspoken clause in every proceeding. Something had shifted, and everyone knew it, even if no one could openly define where the line had been crossed. There was no formal announcement undoing or confirming the contested charter revision. Instead, silence held its position at the center of institutional response. Edward's return to duties appeared outwardly seamless, yet those close to the process noted a change in tone, more restrained, measured, as though every interaction now passed through an additional layer of awareness. Nothing was said differently, but everything felt recalibrated, as if the system itself had learned to speak more cautiously after the fracture. Behind closed doors, internal reviews continued without interruption, moving through documents, approvals, and procedural pathways that had once been considered stable and unquestioned. Every step was re-examined, not in search of immediate blame, but in pursuit of structural clarity. The focus had shifted from reaction to reconstruction, from identifying what happened to understanding how such a sequence had been possible within a framework built on precision and control. Sophie's recognition remained in a state of administrative ambiguity, neither fully restored nor formally removed in any definitive public sense. It existed instead in a suspended condition within internal records, a detail that continued to generate quiet tension among those responsible for ceremonial and legal alignment. That uncertainty became symbolic of the wider situation itself, an unresolved element sitting inside a system that relied on resolution. In response, council protocols began to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. Document verification procedures were tightened, approval trails became more closely monitored, and informal assumptions that once guided routine validation were replaced with stricter confirmation requirements. These changes were not announced as reforms, but they were felt in every interaction, altering the rhythm of governance in ways that were immediately understood by those inside the system. Institutional trust, while not broken beyond repair, had clearly been recalibrated. The confidence that once allowed procedures to move fluidly without hesitation was now replaced by cautious verification. Each decision carried additional weight. Each signature carried renewed awareness. What had once been automatic had become deliberate. And in that shift, the monarchy revealed not collapse but adjustment under pressure. Throughout it all, the palace chose stability over disclosure, prioritizing long-term continuity rather than immediate transparency. The logic was simple but heavy. Reveal too much too soon, and the structure itself risks further strain. Yet this approach carried its own consequence. Silence preserved order on the surface while leaving interpretation to grow beneath it, where certainty was no longer guaranteed. And within the silence that followed, one truth remained undeniable. Even the most stable institutions do not break loudly, they change quietly, one name at a time. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.